The power to command men and give vehement impulse to their joint action is something which cannot be defined by words, but it is plain and manifest in battles, and whoever commands an army in chief must choose his subordinates by reason of qualities which can alone be tested in actual conflict.
General William Tecumseh Sherman is renowned for his strategy and leadership, and recognizes that only the best must be chosen to lead American soldiers on the battlefield. In the final years of the American Civil War, the United States Cavalry plays an ever-increasingly important role in the Union victory over the Confederate Army. With their expanding numbers, it is important that the cavalry be led by only the finest soldiers of their day. As General of the Army, Ulysses S. Grant has this to say about one of the cavalry's most storied leaders, Philip Sheridan.
I believe General Sheridan has no superior as a general, either living or dead, and perhaps not an equal.
General Sheridan, along with General George Armstrong Custer and legions of other cavalrymen, will soon turn their focus from the war between the states to the war to tame the Wild West.
Near midnight, I sent the dispatch giving the names of the generals captured. In the same dispatch, I wrote, "If the thing is pressed, I think that Lee will surrender." When Mr. Lincoln at City Point received this word from General Grant, who was transmitting every item of news to the President, he telegraphed Grant the laconic message, "Let the thing be pressed."
By the time Robert E. Lee is ready to surrender his Confederate Army in 1865, Major General Philip Sheridan, the rest of the Army, and cavalry leaders, and indeed much of the country, welcomes an end to the fighting. The United States Cavalry had come into its own on the battlefields of the American Civil War. Until 1863, it appeared that the Confederate Army held the edge when it came to cavalry battles and tactics. On June 9th, Confederate Major General Jeb Stuart, planning to oversee a movement of 9,500 troops, including 5 cavalry units, through the Shenandoah Valley and northward to Pennsylvania, is surprised at 4:30 a.m. by attacks from the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, with attacks from Brigadier General John Buford from the northeast, and later from the southeast from Brigadier General David McMurtry Gregg. All told, 11,000 Union cavalrymen charged the unsuspecting, though not fully unprepared, Confederate Cavalry Colonel J.H. Kidd. In Kidd's book, Personal Recollections of a Cavalryman, he describes the battle.
All the fighting in this battle was done on horseback, and no more daring work was done by either side on any of the battlefields of the war than was seen at Brandy Station. It must have been a pretty picture. Federal regiments halting and facing toward the points of the compass whence these attacks came, then falling back to new positions, stubbornly contesting every inch of ground. The fluttering of guidons and battle flags, the flash of sabers and the puffs of pistol shots, altogether a most brilliant spectacle.
While the results of the battle would be called inconclusive, Brandy Station not only marks the beginning of the Gettysburg Campaign, but for the first time, it demonstrates that the Union and Confederate cavalry are evenly matched. The following month sees General Robert E. Lee's defeat and retreat from Gettysburg, becoming an important turning point in the American Civil War. The battle would mark the final Confederate offensive move, with the subsequent retreat and remaining battles of the war seeing only defensive maneuvers from the Southern armies. 2 years later, April 1865, sees Robert E. Lee's army outnumbered and weakened by numerous losses through desertion, defeat, and disease. When General Ulysses S. Grant shatters the defensive lines of the Confederates in the Third Battle of Petersburg, Lee orders an evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond and tries to flee south to join with the Confederate forces in North Carolina. However, relentless harassment from Grant's pursuing Union soldiers drive Lee to hole up in Appomattox. And on April 8th, Major General George Armstrong Custer's cavalry division successfully seizes and destroys a train loaded with Confederate supplies and guns. The battle at Appomattox Station not only severs Lee's supply line, but stops the Confederate Army in their tracks and forces Confederate artillery divisions into battle against Union cavalrymen without infantry support. That same day, Grant sends a message to Lee detailing terms of surrender. It is assumed by the Union Army that this meant an end to the war. Lee, on the other hand, is determined to make a final effort to escape the Union forces. On April 9th, assured that the fighting was drawing to a close, General Sheridan's cavalry was surprised to find Confederate corps advancing upon them. Sheridan himself describes the events of that day.
I decided to attack at once, and formations were ordered at a trot for a charge by Custer's and Devon's divisions down the slope leading to the camps. Devon's preparations were but partially completed when an aide-de-camp galloped up with the word from Custer, "Lee has surrendered. Do not charge. The white flag is up." The enemy, perceiving that Custer was forming for attack, had sent the flag out to his front and stopped the charge just in time. I had once sent word of the truce to General Ord, and hearing nothing more from Custer himself, I supposed that he had gone down to the courthouse to join a mounted group of Confederates that I could see near there. So I, too, went toward them, galloping down a narrow ridge, staff and orderlies following. But we had not got halfway to the courthouse when, from a skirt of timber to our right, not more than 300 yards distant, a musketry fire was opened on us. This halted us, when, waving my hat, I called out to the firing party that we were under a truce and they were violating it. This did not stop them, however, so we hastily took shelter in a ravine so situated as to throw the ridge between us and the danger. We traveled in safety, and then by a gentle ascent approached the courthouse. I was in advance, followed by a sergeant carrying my battle flag. When I got within about 150 yards of the enemy's line, which was immediately in front of the courthouse, some of the Confederates leveled their pieces at us, and I again halted. Their officers kept their men from firing, however, but meanwhile a single-handed contest had begun behind me, for on looking back I heard a Confederate soldier demanding my battle flag from the color-bearer, thinking, no doubt, that we were coming in as prisoners. The sergeant had drawn his saber and was about to cut the man down, but at a word from me he desisted and carried the flag back to my staff, his assailant quickly realizing that the boot was on the other leg. These incidents determined me to remain where I was till the return of a staff officer whom I had sent over to demand an explanation from the group of Confederates for which I had been heading. He came back in a few minutes with apologies for what had occurred and informed me that General Gordon and General Wilcox were the superior officers in the group. As they wished me to join them, I rode up with my staff, but we had hardly met when in front of Merritt firing began. When quiet was restored, Gordon remarked, "General Lee asks for a suspension of hostilities pending the negotiations which he is having with General Grant." I rejoined, "I have been constantly informed of the progress of the negotiations, and think it singular that while such discussions are going on, General Lee should have continued his march and attempted to break through my lines this morning. I will entertain no terms except that General Lee shall surrender to General Grant on his arrival here. If these terms are not accepted, we will renew hostilities." Gordon replied, General Lee's army is exhausted. There is no doubt of his surrender to General Grant.
When Grant's own Union forces arrive to aid Sheridan's cavalry, Lee finds himself surrounded on 3 sides and finally agrees to sit down with Grant and negotiate a surrender. Lee might have escaped to Lynchburg if it weren't for the general that Grant spoke so highly of, General Philip Henry Sheridan. Born to Irish immigrants and raised in Somerset, Ohio, Philip Henry Sheridan works, as a boy, in several general stores. Sheridan will always be short in stature, reaching a height of 5'5" when fully grown. Later, President Abraham Lincoln will famously describe him as
a brown, chunky little chap with a long body, short legs, not enough neck to hang him, and such long arms that if his ankles itch, he can scratch them without stooping.
His military career begins when, in 1848, one of Sheridan's regular customers, United States Congressman Thomas Ritchie, recommends Sheridan's appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Ritchie's initial choice for the appointment failed an entrance exam and was dismissed for having a poor attitude. Sheridan fares only slightly better at the academy, and in his 3rd year, he is suspended for fist-fighting and threatening to stab another cadet with a bayonet in response to what Sheridan perceived as an insult. In 1853, Sheridan graduates 34th in his class of 52. Commissioned as a brevet 2nd lieutenant after his graduation, Sheridan receives assignments to the 1st and 4th U.S. Infantry at Fort Duncan, Texas, and Redding, California. While serving with the 4th Infantry, Sheridan becomes involved with the Yakima and Rogue River Wars, not only fighting with Indians in the Pacific Northwest, but acquiring useful skill in diplomatic relations with the natives. Just before the outset of the Civil War in 1861, Sheridan is promoted to 1st lieutenant. By May, he is made captain. A year later, Sheridan finds himself appointed colonel of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry, in spite of having no previous experience either leading or participating in mounted battle. Sheridan's leadership experience with the 4th Infantry ensures that his first time commanding cavalry forces in battle is a successful one. In the aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh, Colonel Sheridan holds back the forces of Confederate cavalry, led by Brigadier General James R. Chalmers, as Confederate General Braxton Bragg tries to regain control of the rail junction 20 miles north of Booneville, Mississippi. Sheridan's efforts cost Chalmers 65 Confederate troops and causes Bragg to abandon his attempt at taking the rail junction. It also earned Sheridan his promotion to Brigadier General. The attention paid to Sheridan by his superiors soon extends to General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant, who taps Sheridan to command the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac in April of 1864. By the following year, Sheridan is leading his cavalry in what will prove to be the final actions of the Civil War, the Appomattox Campaign. Stationed at Dinwiddie Courthouse, Sheridan writes to Major General Gouverneur K. Warren of the Union Army's 5th Corps with information on enemy movement and a plan of attack.
I am holding in front of Dinwiddie Courthouse, on the road leading to Five Forks, for 3/4 of a mile with General Custer's division. The enemy are in his immediate front, lying so as to cover the road just this side of A. Adams' house, which leads across Chamberlain's Bed, or Run. I understand you have a division at J. Boisseau's. If so, you are in rear of the enemy's line and almost on his flank. I will hold on here. Possibly they may attack Custer at daylight. If so, attack instantly and in full force. Attack at daylight anyhow, and I will make an effort to get the road this side of Adams' house. And if I do, you can capture the whole of them. Any force moving down the road I am holding or on the White Oak Road will be in the enemy's rear, and in all probability get any force that may escape you by a flank movement. Do not fear my leaving here. If the enemy remains, I shall fight at daylight. P. H. Sheridan, Major General.
When Warren fails to muster his troops until 4 p.m. that afternoon, Sheridan furiously and controversially removes Warren from his command, effectively ending his military career. It is later ruled that while Grant did defer to Sheridan's judgment on such matters, that Sheridan had no authority to remove Warren. In spite of this confusion, the Battle of Five Forks, the skirmish in question, becomes known as the Confederates' Waterloo, and 2 days later, Robert E. Lee would begin his retreat west, eventually reaching his final position of the war, Appomattox Courthouse. In the years following the Civil War, Sheridan continues to serve with the cavalry, not only as a part of the Indian Wars of the West, but as a crusader for the protection of some of America's most pristine land, Yellowstone National Park. While the preservation of the frontier was a priority for Sheridan, so too was the protection of those Americans who wanted to expand the country to the west. It was during the Indian Wars where Sheridan would once again ride alongside a cavalry general, also present during the Appomattox campaign, and a man who came to Sheridan's rescue at the Battle of Five Forks. Perhaps the most storied cavalryman of them all, General George Armstrong Custer.
Custer, with flashing eye and flowing hair, charging at the head of his men, was a grand and picturesque figure, the more so by reason of his fantastic uniform, which made him a conspicuous mark for the enemy's bullets. But a coward in Custer's uniform would have become the laughingstock of the Army.
While Custer is perhaps best remembered for his last stand, the man's legend begins at West Point in 1858, where he at once demonstrates a contempt for rules and authority. A young schoolteacher, born and educated in Ohio, roommates notice that Custer is indifferent to whether or not he is prepared for his classes or his drill. Nearly facing expulsion in all of the 3 years Custer spent at the academy, he earns one of the worst conduct records in the academy's history, racking up 726 demerits, the record total. In spite of his conduct, and of graduating dead last in his class, the outbreak of the Civil War sees Custer graduate a year early. And while normal circumstances would have seen Custer assigned to a backwater outpost, Custer instead serves as a second lieutenant in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry in the First Battle of Bull Run. Custer quickly proves himself to be an able leader and tactician. Serving under General Sheridan, Custer leads successful campaigns against the Confederates in such battles as 3rd Winchester and Cedar Creek. During the Appomattox campaign, Custer is given a brevet, or temporary wartime promotion, to Major General, and his actions in battle more than justify the honor. A fellow Major General under Sheridan, Alfred Thomas Archimedes Torbert, recalls the fearless and tireless efforts of Custer as he led his cavalry unit to a decisive victory.
The next day, I had received orders from Major General Sheridan to start out at daylight and whip the rebel cavalry or get whipped myself. Brigadier General Custer captured 6 pieces of artillery, all they had on the back road, all of their headquarters wagons, ordnance, ambulance, and wagon trains. There could hardly have been a more complete victory and rout.
As Robert E. Lee retreats in April of 1865, Custer's division repeatedly harasses and blocks the path of the Confederate soldiers, reportedly becoming the first Union squad to receive a flag of truce from the Confederate forces. In the year following the war, Custer finds himself a bit adrift. After marching Union occupation forces of the 2nd Division Cavalry from Alexandria, Louisiana to Hampstead, Texas, Custer's unit is mustered out and replaced with the 6th Cavalry Regiment, and his wartime rank is stripped, returning to his original rank of captain. He takes a leave of absence, during which Custer considers careers in mining, railroads, and politics. However, by 1867, Custer is back in the saddle again. Sheridan has been tasked by Commanding General Ulysses S. Grant to restore order to the Great Plains. Violence in Texas, the Dakotas, and Colorado between settlers and Indian peoples has escalated in the final years of the Civil War. Brevet Major General George Armstrong Custer is first stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, before taking part in campaigns against the Cheyenne and establishing Camp Supply, a fort embedded in Indian territory, as support for Sheridan's campaign against the Southern Plain Indians in the winter of 1868. It is from this lonely outpost, in what is now part of the state of Oklahoma, that Custer would lead his most famous raids with the 7th Cavalry and engage in some of the bloodiest conflicts of the Indian Wars. Custer defends the actions of the cavalry in their engagement with the Indians in his biography, My Life on the Plains, published in 1874.
There are two classes of people who are always eager to get up an Indian war: the Army and our frontiersmen. I quote from an editorial on the Indian question, which not long since appeared in the columns of one of the leading New York daily newspapers. That this statement was honestly made, I do not doubt, but that instead of it being true, it could not have been further from the truth. I will attempt to show. I assert, and all candid persons familiar with the subject will sustain the assertion, that of all classes of our population, the Army and the people living on the frontier entertain the greatest dread of an Indian war, and are willing to make great sacrifices to avoid its horrors.
After the Civil War, it is the policy of the United States to assign all Indians to reservations, with the Army and the cavalry designated to keep them there. However, an influx of settlers into the American West, thanks to the boom of railroad construction and gold rushes in certain towns, creates frictions and tensions. While fierce cavalrymen like General Philip Sheridan and General George Custer are dispatched into the continuing battle with Indians, the cavalrymen come armed with weapons that have been honed and perfected during the Civil War.
Pick up your sabers and fight like gentlemen.
About the only good use of a saber during wartime is for roasting meat over a campfire.
By the end of the American Civil War, trial, error, and innovation by weapons manufacturers, at the behest of the United States government, sees the cavalry outfitted with newer, more reliable weaponry. The Army still insists upon issuing sabers to its cavalrymen. However, some generals, including Custer, order their men to leave the impractical arms behind. As no bayonets were issued, some cavalrymen carry personal hunting knives, like Bowie knives, for use in hand-to-hand combat. For mounted shock weapons, the revolver is the issued firearm, specifically the model 1873 single-action Colt .45. The 6-shot barrel is rotated by hand by pulling back the hammer after each shot. Later revolvers would rotate the chamber automatically, but the model 1873 earns the nickname the Thumb Buster. Still, the gun's solid design makes the piece a rugged and reliable tool for mounted battle. Initially, during the Indian Wars, Custer's 7th Cavalry had been experimenting with using the Spencer carbine. The lever-action rifle is not embraced by the U.S. Army, as officials worry that the ability to rapidly fire, while perhaps providing a momentary advantage on the battlefield, would cause soldiers to waste and deplete their ammunition supply. The breech-loading model 1873 Springfield trapdoor carbine becomes the rifle of the cavalry throughout the Indian Wars, though Custer's 7th Cavalry would be the last division to receive them in 1876. The trapdoor is the first Army standard issue breech-loading rifle. While many reports exist of the trapdoor rifle jamming in the heat of battle, the gun is still far more reliable and efficient than anything soldiers have carried so far, especially compared to barrel-loading muskets used during the Civil War. Thus armed, the cavalry rides into battle with Indians. While the United States employs the most advanced weaponry at the time, the sheer number of Indians, their undying courage and spirit, and the wide cross-section of both traditional and modern weapons and firearms that they trade for becomes a serious roadblock on the way to peaceful resolution on the plains. The cavalry also makes use of a previously untapped resource in the West: African American cavalrymen and soldiers, having earned their freedom in the Civil War, now wished to fight for their country as buffalo soldiers.
It is not generally known that Atlanta has a Negro cadet at the United States National Military Academy at West Point. He is about 20 years old, a stoutish fellow weighing perhaps 150 pounds, and a smart, bright, intelligent boy. His father is a shoemaker and gave him the euphonious name of Henry Ossian Flipper. It is an astonishing fact that, socially, the boys from the northern and western states will have nothing to do with their colored brother. Not even the Massachusetts boys will associate with him. But the sensible Flipper accepted the situation and proudly refused to intrude himself on the white boys. The feeling of ostracism is so strong that a white boy who dared to recognize a colored cadet would be himself ostracized by the other white cubs, even of radical extraction.
In 1877, Henry Ossian Flipper becomes the very first African American to graduate from the United States National Military Academy. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in July of that year, Flipper reports to Fort Sill in Oklahoma for assignment to the 10th Cavalry. Instead of sending him on to Fort Concho, headquarters of the 10th Cavalry, more commonly known as the Buffalo Soldiers, the brass at Fort Sill put Flipper to work on menial tasks, including digging a ditch to drain a nearby swamp. When finally the orders come to send Flipper to Fort Concho for his assignment, Henry Ossian Flipper is then made a part of A Troop and named the first non-white officer to lead the Buffalo Soldiers. Officially founded at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in 1866, the Buffalo Soldiers is a moniker given to the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, as well as the 24th and 25th Infantry, all units of African American soldiers, traditionally led by white officers. Many of the units are raised and operated in the final years of the American Civil War and continue to develop and mature during the Indian Wars. In skirmishes throughout the southwestern United States, the soldiers earn their nickname from their Indian opponents that they face on the prairies and the plains. Soon, the Cheyenne Indians are warning their fellow tribes of a new warrior fighting for the Americans, who had fought like a cornered buffalo, who, like a buffalo, had suffered wound after wound, yet had not died. While African Americans have made great progress towards equality since the end of the Civil War, there is still a long road before them. Henry Ossian Flipper, as well as countless other units and individuals, faced prejudice and even violence, sometimes even from those who had been assigned to lead them. In 1881, Flipper faced court-martial for a discrepancy that was found in the commissary funds at Fort Davis. Flipper was quartermaster and commissary officer until Colonel Shafter, known to harass officers and soldiers he didn't like, stripped his quartermaster title and commanded that the commissary funds be kept in Flipper's private quarters rather than their usual place in the quartermaster's safe. While Flipper suspected foul play, and Captain Merritt Barber of the 16th U.S. Infantry defended Flipper valiantly in court, in December, the court-martial rules that Henry is not guilty of embezzlement, but still dismisses him for conduct unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman. In spite of this prejudice, personal and physical attacks by their own fellow officers, the Buffalo Soldiers continued to prove themselves as a valuable asset throughout the late 19th and early into the 20th century. In addition to fighting in the Indian Wars, units of Buffalo Soldiers continue to serve with the United States Cavalry in the Spanish-American War and maintain border safety between the United States and Mexico during World War I, and participate in Woodrow Wilson's punitive expedition in 1917 in an attempt to track down the notorious outlaw Pancho Villa. In 1899, Buffalo Soldiers also become some of the very first National Park Rangers, as members of the 9th Cavalry and 24th Infantry are assigned to maintain, protect, and preserve such parks, such as Yosemite, Kings Canyon, and Sequoia National. Before the United States military began to fully integrate, members of the so-called Buffalo Soldiers served proudly in World War II, with the 9th and 10th Cavalry Divisions being dissolved to form more service-oriented black platoons, including artillery and tank destroyer units. During the Korean War, the 24th Infantry becomes the last segregated troop to serve for the United States military. Displaced from their homeland and forced to move from Kansas to Colorado, members of the Southern Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, and other tribes begin to attack white settlements in Kansas, Colorado, and Texas in the summer of 1868. The Southern Cheyenne, led by Chief Black Kettle, are camped on the banks of the Washita River in November of 1868. General Philip Sheridan, in response to the continued Indian raids on American settlers throughout the summer and fall, has devised a plan to attack the Cheyenne encampments, destroying supplies and livestock. General Custer is charged with leading the raid and explains his strategy in his autobiography.
Indians contemplating a battle, either offensive or defensive, are always anxious to have their women and children removed from all danger. For this reason, I decided to locate our camp as close as convenient to Chief Black Kettle's village, knowing that the close proximity of their women and children and their necessary exposure in case of conflict would operate as a powerful argument in favor of peace when the question of peace or war came to be discussed.
By November 26th, attempts to negotiate peace between both the Indians and the settlers, and among the Indian tribes themselves, have resulted in a stalemate. Custer's forces, divided into 4 units, stalk an Indian war party back to Black Kettle's village and attack at daybreak the following day. Chief Black Kettle and his wife are among those Indians killed, and while Custer quickly takes the village, he had been unaware of the proximity of Black Kettle's village to another Indian camp, until he notices large groups of Indians gathering on adjacent hilltops. In fear of attack, General Custer orders some men to take defensive positions while leading a charge to destroy and seize Indian horses and munitions. The gathering Indians retreat when confronted. The battle at Washita River affirms General Custer's reputation as a cavalryman, but at the same time, a shadow was cast over incidents involving one of Custer's majors, Joel Elliott, who led a small detachment of cavalry into a doomed battle with a mixed party of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa Indians. Major Elliott had apparently broken with Custer's orders in leading the charge, which led to the death of 20 soldiers. Custer brashly dismissed Elliott, leaving the scene of battle without confirming Elliott's fate. Feelings of resentment towards Custer spread through the 7th Cavalry, including H Company Captain Frederick Benteen, a personal friend of Elliott. 8 years later, Benteen failed to reach the Battle of Little Bighorn in time to save Custer and his men, and many wonder if this failing was merely circumstantial or if Benteen's enmity played a role.
If the lives and property of the citizens of Montana can best be protected by striking Mountain Chief's band, I want them struck. Tell Baker to strike them hard.
In the Montana Territory in 1869, the Blackfeet, Blood, and Piegan Indians, collectively known as the Blackfoot Confederacy, have engaged in hostilities with the white settlers for years. Bringing matters to a head, the murder of Malcolm Clark, a white trader who had married and fathered children with Blackfeet Indian women, was killed by a Piegan warrior, Owl Child. Owl Child sought revenge on Clark after Clark had beaten him in front of a group of Blackfeet Indians as punishment for stealing Clark's horses. Accounts from Indians also raised the possibility that Clark had raped Owl Child's wife, and further rumors tell the story that she had given birth to a stillborn, mixed-race baby. The Clark killing is cause for outcry in the area among the white settlers. They demand that the government suppress the outlaw Indians and protect them from further attacks. U.S. Army representatives issue a command to the Blackfoot Confederacy. Owl Child is to be killed and his body delivered to United States authorities within 2 weeks. 2 weeks come and go, and soon General Sheridan dispatches Major Eugene Baker to lead a punitive expedition in January of 1870. Tragically, Baker, a known alcoholic, attacks the camp of Heavy Runner, a peaceful leader who had been previously protected by the U.S. Army. When Heavy Runner is alerted to the cavalry's presence, he rushes to show Baker documentation from the Indian Bureau, and he is shot. After the first shot, the rest of Baker's men open fire, slaughtering elderly men, women, and children, as most of the men were out hunting. Mountain Chief, leading the band that was actually reported to be harboring Owl Child, gets word of the massacre and escapes the Marias River area. The massacre at Marias River not only weakens the Blackfeet's hostilities, disease and fighting had thinned out their ranks, but leads to now President Ulysses S. Grant to adopt a peace policy in Indian relations, rather than leaving Indian affairs to the United States Army. Sadly, the policy does not end the fighting between Indians and the Americans, as one of the cavalry's most famous fighters is slain in one of the West's most famous battles.
I went over the battlefield carefully, with a view to determine how the battle was fought. I arrived at the conclusion I hold now that it was a rout, a panic, until the last man was killed.
First-hand accounts from Americans at the Battle of Little Bighorn do not exist. None of the 5 companies under Custer's command survived the attack, and as Captain Benteen's report of the scene after the battle illustrates, there is probably much chaos. Bad intelligence leads the 7th Cavalry into the Montana Territory to quell what had been dubbed the Sioux Wars. A coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians, led by Chiefs Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and others, prepares for war after years of increasing tensions with Americans encroaching on their sacred land, and the vision of Sitting Bull, who foretells of soldiers falling into my camp like grasshoppers from the sky. While reports from the Army estimated no more than 800 Indian combatants, Custer is actually faced with thousands upon thousands. As Major Marcus Reno and Captain Benteen contend with assaults from Crazy Horse and other warriors, Custer's forces are stopped east of the Little Bighorn River. Debate continues today about the true events of the battle, but the result is still clear. General Custer and his cavalrymen are completely obliterated. One of the only eyewitness accounts of the massacre comes from Lakota Chief Red Horse, who fought in the battle and recalled the events 5 years later.
The soldiers charged the Sioux camp about noon. The soldiers were divided, one party charging right into the camp. After driving these soldiers across the river, the Sioux charged the different soldiers of Custer's below and drive them in confusion. These soldiers became foolish, many throwing away their guns and raising their hands, saying, "Sioux, pity us, take us prisoner." None were left alive for even a few minutes. These different soldiers discharged their guns but little. I took a gun and 2 belts off of 2 dead soldiers. Out of one belt, 2 cartridges were gone. Out of the other, 5. The Sioux took the guns and cartridges off the dead soldiers and went to the hill on which the soldiers were, surrounded and fought them with the guns and cartridges of the dead soldiers. Had the soldiers not divided, I think they would have killed many Sioux. The different soldiers that the Sioux killed made 5 brave stands. Once the Sioux charged right in the midst of the different soldiers and scattered them all, fighting amongst the soldiers hand to hand. The Sioux went but a short distance before they separated and surrounded the soldiers. I could see the officers riding in front of the soldiers and hear them shooting. Now the Sioux had many killed. The soldiers killed 136 and wounded 160 Sioux.
Other Lakota eyewitnesses seem to agree that the battle took less than half an hour. The aftermath of the battle wasn't even discovered until 2 days later. George Armstrong Custer was found and buried on the battlefield. Later, he will be exhumed and returned to the place he began his military career. Custer's final resting place is the West Point Cemetery, where he is buried on October 10th, 1877. In many ways, Custer's last stand serves as the close of a chapter in the history of the United States Cavalry. But from the end of the 19th into the beginning of the 20th century, the proud legacy of the cavalry continues to proliferate. As the cavalry rebuilds in the years following the Battle of Little Bighorn, technological advances in weapons, transportation, and communication are made, sometimes by leaps and bounds. These advances, while adding much to the advantage of the American cavalrymen, are still but only new tools to be utilized by the most capable leaders. The United States Cavalry's tradition of legendary leaders has only begun, with courageous figures emerging to fight for their country both on America's home soil and abroad as the world goes to war. Rising to meet such challenges are such figures as Theodore Roosevelt, John J. Pershing, and George S. Patton, and Medal of Honor recipients like Sergeant Major Edward L. Baker and Corporal Dennis Bell. These men, and many others, through their bravery, dedication, and sacrifice, will continue to solidify the reputation of the United States Cavalry.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.